My name again is Rabbi Marcus Rubenstein. It is wonderful to be with you, learning some Torah together and learning the foundations of Judaism, which is so important. We're starting a new unit this month. It's the first session of this foundations class of this month, which is entitled Denominations and Conservative Judaism. So really, this class is going to focus on types of Jews, right? And both the modern denominations and the ethnicities, the ethnic differences within Judaism. We'll have a special focus, really, the last session on, to spend a whole session on conservative Judaism because, well, conservative synagogue, I'm a conservative rabbi, you're doomed to get my perspective. We'll really go heavily into that today. We'll just go through a general overview of the denominations, the different kinds of ethnicities in Judaism, the kind of questions of why the denominations exist, and what question were they answering? Why are denominations a modern thing? If they're a modern thing, why didn't they exist before? And so those questions sort of will all be answered. We'll talk a little bit about, are denominations good? Are they bad? There's different opinions about that, pros and cons. Next week, we'll dive deeper into both Reform and Orthodox. It's really three major denominations that are usually broken down into: Reform, Orthodox, and Conservative. And so we'll explain Reform and Orthodox, which are not these synagogues, but still important to learn about and understand how to think. And then finally, the last session, we'll really focus on conservative Judaism. So, sound good, everybody? All right, wonderful. Here it is for those in person. Here's yours. And then share this. Hold on just 1 second for those following along online. Let's give me 1 second so I can open up the document. Okay. All right. Those. See? Wonderful. All right. Let's begin. The first real denominations or breakdown in Judaism has to do with the 12 tribes. Ooh, someone is in the waiting room for the chapel. I don't know how to get to them. Okay. I'm sorry. Okay. Regardless, too bad someone's waiting in the chapel. So I can't leave and exit. So regardless, we'll start here. All right. Denominations are different. The first really breakdown is really the 12 tribes, right? The 12 tribes of Israel. And again, originally the Jews were, is Abraham a Jew? No, it's definitely not a Jew. Adam's definitely not a Jew. He's just a human being. Abraham's not a Jew, really. Isaac's not a Jew. Really, where we start to get the Jewish people is really starting with Jacob, whose name is Israel, right? His name gets changed to Israel, and so we become known as the children of Israel, right? So usually that means inclusive of Jacob. And Jacob famously had 12 sons, actually one daughter as well. I'm sorry, he had 11 sons and one daughter, but we'll get to why it's 12 in a second. Basically, those children became the tribal groups and the descendants of those children became the tribal divisions of Bnei Israel, right? Quite literally, the children of Israel. So each child kind of had a tribe. So, for example, there is Shimon, there's the tribe of Levi, there's the tribe of Dan and Naphtali, and all these different tribal names. And very, very important. And these are really the original divisions of the Jewish people. So much so that when the Jewish people entered Eretz Israel, the land was divided up based on a tribal basis. That there was regions where each tribe would live. And again, from what you hear from the, if you've taken some of the Jewish history, if you're part of our course last month and everything like that, you might have heard a little bit about this. that historically these people ended up in the land in these different regions and these different areas. But as we know, in the pre-King period, it's very similar. It's funny, like really does highlight American history. There was this like Articles of Confederation period where really it wasn't B'nai Israel, it was each tribe on its own. No, there was like they would come together, and we see this throughout the book of Judges, and it really Judges is where we see this. A charismatic chieftain would come by and sort of unite the people for military means and unite the tribes, and then it would sort of fall into disarray. So it's really sort of a loose confederacy that would come together for military means with a common, religious tradition and history. Eventually, this kind of fell apart, and people realized this was weak, and the Jewish people asked for one king over the entire Jewish people. And that's really when the tribes sort of united together, still holding their tribal affiliation. But basically, King Saul becomes king, and there's just one nation. Eventually, the kingdom splits into two after the reign of King Solomon, King Shlomo. And it splits into the northern and southern kingdom. The northern kingdom has 10 tribes there, and the southern kingdom only has two. Southern kingdom really is just Judea and a small tribe of Benjamin. While basically all the other tribes were, in the north, to Israel and Judea. And basically, what ends up happening is that unfortunately, the northern Israel, the northern kingdom, or what's called Israel, was conquered by the Assyrians in 720 CE. The Assyrians conquered them and then assimilated them into their population so successfully that we now don't really know they're lost to the Jewish people. That was obviously a long time ago, and that's what we refer to as the 10 lost tribes. If you ever hear that being talked about, a really fun thing. Everyone claims to be the 10 lost tribes. There's Jews in India and Jews all over random places, and everyone wants to be a Jew, right? Everyone wants to be one of the 10 lost tribes. So we really don't know who they are, and we've really lost track of them. And those people really have no halakhic status because we're just unsure of their Jewish heritage. Really, if you're a Jew today, you can be from Judea, and most Jews who are just normal Jews are from Judea. And that's why we call them, come on, what do we call Jews? Judeans. That's where the Jewish term comes from, right? That's why we're Jewish, because we're from Judea. And we're from the tribe of Judah, right? So the majority of Jews are from the tribe of Judah. But basically what ended up happening is the Kohanim, the tribe of Levi, which was one child of Jacob, was given sort of a special status. Basically, everybody from the tribe of Levi is not allowed to own property. If there was an ancient Israelite, if there was an Israelite Davidic king and run by a theocracy, right? Technically, we wouldn't be able to have property, Levi'im, and instead they would have to serve in the Beit HaMikdash. They would have to serve in the temple. They were basically sort of a class of people that had to be in the priesthood based on their ethnicity, and that meant they couldn't own any property and it had to be supported by the community because they were busy working to support the community. There's a subsect amongst Levi'im, which are the children of Aaron. Aaron is Moses' brother. And both Moses, Aaron, Miriam, they're all Levi'im. They all descend from Levi. But Aaron, and specifically Aaron's children, came to be known as Kohanim. Aaron was basically chosen to be the Kohen Gadol, and any of his children are going to be Kohanim. Kohanutis. And the Jewish priesthood is passed in a dynastic manner from male child to male child. So therefore, a subset of Levi'im are Kohanim, or Kohen. The Kohanim really were the priests and really did the actual service and the sacrifices in the temple, and actually really did it. While the Levi'im were more like either custodians or musicians, helped to keep the temple running, but weren't doing the actual service and the sacrifices themselves. They were the ones who carried the Mishkan and carried the tabernacle in the wilderness and everything like that. So we still have Levi'im and Kohanim. Why, you might say, are they lost of the 10 tribes? Well, unlike every other tribe, Levi was not apportioned land in the land of Israel. Why? Because they're not allowed to own land. So instead, Levi'im and Kohanim were split and scattered throughout the land of Israel, and there was like a little bit of Kohanim and Levi'im everywhere because they didn't just work in the temple back then; they also taught. So they were the religious teachers. So therefore they were sort of split, and there was like a little bit of Kohanim and Levim in every little town, right? So that everyone could have religious teachers and instruction. And they would go in shifts down to Beit HaMikdash and work for a couple of weeks there. It's for that reason that we still have Kohanim and Levim left, because the Kohanim and Levim we have left are the ones that lived in Judea, right? They're descended from the Kohanim, the Levim that lived in Judea. And so that's why we still have Kohanim and Levim as well. And, but there's only very few, right? Nice piece of trivia. I'm a Levi. I actually descend from Levi, and my family heritage way going back generation to generation. And you'll see that there are certain symbols on gravestones of Levim. You see a gravestone with hands up like this, that means that they're Kohen. If you see a picture on there, like a vase or something, because it's a symbol that the person was a lady, because they used to wash the Kohanim's hands with the vase, jar of some sort. This day, there are some honors for the Levim and Kohanim in particular in the synagogue to preserve their status. For example, in a traditional synagogue, the Kohen gets the first aliyah from the Torah, the first one to read from the Torah on Shabbat morning. The Levi is supposed to get the second aliyah, and then from then on you can call on each of them. Again, if a Levi or a Kohen is sitting at a meal, they should be the ones to say Birkat Hamazon, to say the blessing over the food, to lead that. In many synagogues, the tradition is the Kohanim still get up to bless the congregation, and during the Musaf prayer in Israel, they do it every single day. In many conservative congregations, they don't do it anymore because there's a belief that we don't believe anymore in dynastic leadership. That's just unjust and un-American. My old synagogue did it. This synagogue doesn't do it. I wish we did it. But every minhag is different. So regardless, that is Leviim and Kohanim. The Leviim, still to this day, if the Kohanim do a blessing during Musaf and bless the congregation, it is the Leviim who have to meet them outside to wash their hands, just again to preserve that Levitical Kohanim. And obviously, if the Beit HaMikdash is built again, which hopefully it will be, as we say, speed in our day, the Kohanim and Levim will be going back to doing their duties again at the temple. And so it's good that we're preserving that lineage. Otherwise, we wouldn't have Kohanim and people to work in the temple. But it's pretty cool. And they've done genetic studies in Levi and Kohanim. We actually have like slightly different genetics than just regular Judeans, and so really interesting. Very cool. But those are sort of the original groups of Jews, if that makes sense. So basically, what ends up happening is the temple is destroyed. Well, before we go on to this point, do we have any questions? Kohanim, Levim, Judaim, 12 tribes, 10 lost tribes? No, that was 100% clear.
So the Levim and Kohanim are part of the 10, and then there are 2 in the south, 2 other tribes in Judea.
Yes, exactly. So yes, so exactly. They're sort of part of the. They're part of the 10. They're part of the 2. It's funny that we do say 10 lost tribes, because it's really not 10. It's really like 9, because the other ones were. The Levim and Kohanim who are with the 10 lost tribes are lost as well, right? So it's kind of like whether it's 9 or it's 10, depends on how you define it. But regardless, most of the Jewish people were lost, right? In that. Make sense? Any other question? Very, very important. Are Kohanim Leviim? It's a good question. This is a 300 level question. Let's see if you understand what I'm talking about here.
Yes, a subset.
Bingo! It's confused a lot of people. Yes, Kohanim are Leviim. Leviim are not necessarily Kohanim, right? You understand how that works, right? Both Moses, Miriam, Aaron, they're all children of Levi, right? But only the children of Aaron are Kohanim. Okay, so that good. I just want to make sure that a lot of people in the pews don't understand that. They think Kohanim is a separate thing than Leviim, and it's different, but it's not.
Is there like significance to does the word Kohen have like a different meaning or like a specific meaning, or is it like just a name? Do these words are these names that also have like meanings?
Well, Levi obviously comes from the Levi, and right. Kohen just means priest.
Okay.
So there was a yeah. So basically that's my answer.
Okay. So Levi is the name of the from the person of the progenitor of the group, and then Kohen is like the name for
It's a
priest.
function, right?
Okay, yes.
Job, right?
Right.
Just like priest, got it?
Got it.
Good. So eventually the temple was destroyed, as we read in the past. Certainly, if you're in our last sessions, around 70 CE. First it was destroyed in 586 BC, then it was destroyed in 70 CE. Regardless, it was eventually destroyed, and Jews scattered across the world. The Romans kicked the Jews out of Jerusalem and Israel in 135 CE after the Bar Kokhba revolt, and Jews scattered throughout the world. They went primarily to Babylon. That was probably the major community in the time after the destruction of the temple and the Bar Kokhba revolt. But regardless, they kind of scattered everywhere. And from that point on, Jews were really broken down based on regional bases. And it's not necessarily just where Jews are from. Remember that technology was very different. So you didn't have global communication like we do now. People weren't as interconnected. So if you were a Jewish community living in Yemen, you didn't hear what was going on in Spain, okay? Because it was across the world, and there's no email, and there's no fax, and there's nothing. So no telephone. You could send maybe a letter if you even knew that they existed, right? So for the most part, your religion was really determined by the local rabbis in your area. And of course, what happens when you're out of communication, you don't sync up, right? So over hundreds and hundreds of years, different traditions, and they're also responding to different issues based on geography, based on economy, everything like that, lifestyles, and they separated. And because of that, Jews from different ethnic areas tend to have sometimes different customs. I'd say like 90% is the same, but there's like 10% that's a little different, just a little different. And they just rule differently throughout time. So the two major delineations in terms of ethnic Jewish categories are Ashkenazi and Sephardi, or Mizrahi. Ashkenazi means Germany in Hebrew, and Sfard means Spain. So technically there are German Jews and Spanish Jews, if you're really reading this literally. That's mostly a misnomer. We just use those terms. Ashkenazi really means Jews from Europe, and really in a probably a better understanding of this, really Jews who lived in places where Christianity was the hegemon, right? That Christianity was the religion of the land, and it was a Christian sovereign area. So whether that was Poland or Russia or England or France, Germany, all places where again, under the ruling power of Christians. And so that's Ashkenazim. And so obviously, because they all came from the same area, but obviously if you live at an area for 1,500 years, your skin color changes, your looks change. You can still see a Jew looks a little different than a Russian. Even a Jew living in Poland or Russia looks a little different than a Russian or a Pole. Like we have a little bit of Semitic features because we're all from Israel originally. But regardless, our skin color changes. We change based on where we are over millennia, right? Unfortunately, because of this, we find a lot in it's getting popular nowadays, especially amongst Black Israelites and different people who say Ashkenazim aren't real Jews because we don't look Jewish, we don't look Semitic, because we lived for 1,500 years in a place that wasn't a cold climate. It was like a cold climate, a different place. So that's one category, Ashkenazim. And Sephardi Mizrahi is the other category. Sephardi was kind of the term that was used through most of history. Nowadays, some Sephardic Jews don't like being called Sephardic because it has nothing to do with Spain, but rather they like being called Mizrahi, which just means from the east. Mizrahi is east, Eastern Jews. And these really were Jews living in lands that were ruled by Muslim hegemonies. And Jews live very differently under Muslims versus Christianity. Both had its positives and negatives. Great books written on how it was different living under which hegemony and which area. But regardless, traditions differed and changed based on the majority religion. I mean, so much of American Judaism is a response to Christianity, the response to American religion. So too was Judaism in Yemen or Judaism in Northern Africa or all these places. But Jews filled up all these areas. You don't think of it like this, But it was basically equal. There was tons of European Jews, there were tons of North African Jews, there were tons of Jews living in every Arabic area, Syria, Iran, Iraq. They were before they were even called those areas. There were Jews living there. That really is Sephardi Mizrahi. Does that make sense? Most of the Jews you will meet at Temple of Aaron are Ashkenazi Jews. It's just in this area, it tends to be mostly Ashkenazi Jews who you meet. It's much rarer to find a Sephardic Jew. But like when I was living in Los Angeles, for that matter, there were tons. It was more common to meet Sephardic Jews who were mostly from Persia or from Iran, all right? And so there's a huge community there. Now, if you go to Israel, interestingly enough, it really is split half and half, if not actually a little bit more Mizrahi, probably Sephardi. So that's so much so that when you go to Israel from America, I was like really surprised to see so many Jews were almost black, if not Arab. They have a very different accent in the way they speak Hebrew. Again, because they come from Arabic lands. For example, Ashkenazi Jews, we speak very differently. So we've lost the ability to say some of the guttural letters like set and ayin in Hebrew. We can't really say because why? In English or in the European language, there are no guttural letters, right? That's not a thing. But in Arabic, there were still guttural letters because Jews spoke Arabic when they were living in Arabic lands. They spoke whatever language, not to each other, but to outsiders. For that matter, so when you meet a Sephardic Jew in Israel, a lot of times they speak with the guttural letters because that was preserved from Arabic, right? That's a learned skill. So for example, let me think of a good one. So ayin is an I in Hebrew, ayin, I. So an Ashkenazi Jew would say ayin, and a Sephardic Jew would say something like ayin, wine. I almost can't say because I was born that way. But if you go to Israel, you'll meet tons of Jews who speak like this. And so it's a huge, huge misnomer that Jews are not native to the land of Eretz Israel or whatever, or that Jews are white. It's just not true. It's just factually false. Actually, probably the majority, they don't look white. It's just that Jews have been expelled from their land for 2,000 years, so skin colors and everything like this changed. And when most people think of Jews in America, they think of white people because that's the Jews we have here. But if you were living in Israel, you wouldn't think that. So very, very important and really important to talk about. Make sense so far? We're good? Any questions, confusions? Another thing, good thing to know, we also speak differently in other ways too. For example, Ashkenazim tend to put the emphasis on the front of the Hebrew, and while Sephardim tend to put the emphasis on the accent on the end of the Hebrew. For example, Shabbat is a good one. So Ashkenazim, if you're going to say good Shabbos, Shabbos, Shabbat, Shabbat, I can't even say it. Shabbos, right? That's Ashkenazi. You see here the accents on the Shah, not the Bat, right? Or Bas, right? While Sephardim will say Shabbat, okay? Now you might have noticed the difference between the T and the S there. That's because certain letters, like for example, Tav without a negation, this is all Chinese to you, that's okay. The T sound that Sephardim say, for Ashkenazim, they say a Sa sound. So it will be Shabbos, while in Sephardic pronunciation, it will be Shabbat. Now, in modern Israel, almost completely has taken on the Sephardic pronunciation of Hebrew. For example, that's why when I speak Hebrew and when I daven, and my Hebrew is all Sephardic because I learned modern Hebrew. In Israel, they don't use they don't speak Hebrew. Even if you're Ashkenazi, you don't speak with an Ashkenazic Tom accent. The only people who do that, Hasidic Jews, who block out all modernity and don't believe in the state of Israel. Just a little different. So if you might hear some Jews saying Shabbos, you might hear some Jews saying Shabbat, right? They're all the same. It just depends on the way you speak. Make sense so far? Right. So this is a very big difference. Like if you go to a Chabad rabbi, talk to Solomon over there in Mendota Heights or any of the Chabad rabbis, they all pronounce Hebrew with a Ashkenazic accent. So they'll say Shabbos and Kashrus, right, and things like that. Well, if you talk to a conservative rabbi who learns modern Hebrew at the university and lived in Israel, will say Kashrut, right, or Shabbat, right? And it's pretty much universal amongst conservative rabbis. Okay. Makes sense so far?
So I understand. So I understand what you're saying. So for the Ashkenazi pronunciation, it's the front of the word where the pronunciation is. But how does the Shabbat? How does the A? Why does the AT at the end of the word become OS? Shabbos. Shabbat becomes Shabbos.
Yeah, so some of the accents are changed, like Shabbat, we pronounce what's called a kamatz as ah. Well, I'm sorry, not a kamatz. Yes, a kamatz, I'm sorry. We pronounce a kamatz in Sephardic Hebrew as ah, while Ashkenazic Jews often pronounce it as oh, Shabbos, right? Now, again, I'm not doing it perfectly because I'm not, that's not the way I speak. But yeah, so it just, again, there's some vowels that are pronounced a little differently. It's the same language, same everything, right? But it's just pronounced differently. Again, this is based on what sounds we're comfortable for. If your native language was Russian or English or Italian or Spanish or something like that, or German, right? There are going to be certain sounds that are easier for you to say than if your native language is Arabic, right? You're going to pronounce things differently. I mean, try to teach English to someone who has an accent from India, right? They're going to speak differently than someone you taught English to who lives in Germany, right? Make sense?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So one of the things that Jews did, mostly Jews spoke the language of the land. They used Hebrew. Hebrew was really not a spoken language. Hebrew was used only as the sacred tongue. It was the language of Jewish scholarship. So if you wrote a book about Torah in some way, or a commentary or whatever, it would be written in Hebrew. But basically, it was not used as a spoken language. Instead, the spoken language of most Jews amongst themselves was a mixture of Hebrew and the language in which they lived, which basically created another language. And so we have a lot of languages like that. Probably the most famous one of them all is Yiddish. Again, because you live here, right? You live in America, where there's tons of Ashkenazi Jews. Yiddish is a combination. It's basically 60, 70% German, 10%, 15% Slavic, and then like 10% Hebrew. But the thing that's different about it is and it's true with all these languages, it's the characters that it's written in is Hebrew characters. Okay? So it's like, for example, if a German hears Yiddish, they can understand a lot of it. It'll sound weird to them, but they can understand a lot of it because it's 70% German. But they would not be able to read it because it's all written in Hebrew characters. And this was, again, a way for Jews to keep their heritage and also create a secret, like sort of almost like a code language amongst Jews, a trade language that they can sort of say things without the goyim hearing. We see this phenomena popping up almost like everywhere. Everywhere where Jews live, this phenomenon popped up. So, for example, Farsi, right? Farsi is a combination of Persian, is what the language of the Jews of Iran spoke, and it's a combination of Persian and Hebrew, basically, right? So mostly Persian, right, but written in Hebrew characters. That's Farsi, right? Ladino is Spanish, is the same thing with Spanish for Jews who lived in Spain. They spoke Ladino. Okay, there is a Judeo-Arabic. Okay, which I know sounds silly with the ongoing history right now, but Jews who really Arabic was their spoken language, but when they spoke amongst themselves, they snuck in some Hebrew. And again, and it's written in Hebrew characters. Famous books like Maimonides' commentary on the Mishnah and his famous Guide for the Perplexed were written in Judeo-Arabic. So again, looks like sounds like Arabic, looks like Hebrew. Okay, so these are all diasporic languages in its very nature, and so Yiddish is really only one of these that really is still spoken. There's a large community of people speaking it. It's mostly Hasidic communities who, again, refuse to speak Hebrew because that still is the Lashon Kodesh, they call it, the holy language that's only set aside for holy matters. And they also don't believe in the modern state of Israel, so that they see Hebrew as a Zionist, speaking Hebrew as a Zionist thing. Hasidim amongst themselves really speak Yiddish. The people with the black hats and pace and whatever that you might see. The other languages really aren't spoken anymore. There are some Judeo-Arabic speakers who live in Israel now. They used to live in Yemen. There's still some Farsi speakers amongst really, really old Persians and Iranian Jews. But for the most part, they're dead languages. The only one that's still living is Yiddish, really. Make sense so far? Okay. Basically, once the land of Israel was created into the state of Israel in 1948, and even before then, there was a real concerted effort to resurrect Hebrew as a spoken language, but it wasn't a spoken language for almost 2,000 years. And so one of the greatest marvels is that Hebrew was resurrected as a spoken language. That's almost never it's never happened. Actually, you ask linguists, has a language ever been resurrected after 2,000 years into a fully spoken modern language? Never happened except in the case of Hebrew. Huge miracle. So very, very important. So there was a really concerted effort for everyone to speak Hebrew, and yeah, that's why the spoken language is Hebrew in Israel, and now is the language. I believe at least the language. It is the language of the Jewish people. I believe, and again, this is my soapbox, that these other languages like Yiddish should die. I don't speak Yiddish, and I don't want to learn it because, well, I'm a Zionist, right? I believe that all Jews should speak Hebrew and know Hebrew, and that's our language. We don't need any of these remnants of the diaspora anymore, because we've returned to our land. Okay. Oh, last one, Amharic, right? Those are the Ethiopian Jews. Same thing, but in Ethiopia. Okay. Jews who lived in Ethiopia, they spoke their own language called Amharic, and that is definitely still a spoken language amongst Ethiopian Jews, most of whom who have made Aliyah to Israel. Make sense so far? Again, I really lean into this because, again, this false claim is out there that Jews are only white, or that Jews aren't indigenous to the land, or what have you. But I think you can easily see from here that Jews come from all different cultural backgrounds, and so this is gonna, like, if you live in Israel, there are tons of black Jews. They look like Ethiopians, right? There are tons of them. They didn't convert into Jews; they've been Jews forever, but they lived in Ethiopia for 1,500 years. So that's the way they look, and you'll meet them. They didn't convert; they've been Jews longer. It's just as long as any other Jew has. But you got to go to Israel. These people, unfortunately, they don't exist so much. I mean, one good example is our shaliach right now. He's about to leave, but he's been here for 2 years. He's an Ethiopian Jew. Okay, he never converted to Judaism. His parents schlepped to Israel by foot, and once his people were kicked out of Ethiopia. He's got an amazing story with that. But looks like a completely black person, but has been Jewish forever. So don't buy into it. Okay, that's Narishkeit. It's obviously people who just don't understand the basic facts of what they're talking, or just using stereotypes from watching too much Seinfeld, I guess. So make sense so far? Okay, let's keep going. So basically, this huge thing happened, which was called enlightenment. And if you've went in before I go on, actually, any questions? Let me make room just in case you have questions. No questions. Man, I'm clear. Okay, wonderful. Well, there's this big thing that happened called enlightenment, and so if you remember from social studies class or whatever, enlightenment really was the coming of modernity, the idea of the scientific method, that people should be free and should have certain rights that are inalienable, and everything like this. And this is around the 1700s. It really was. And one of the things that happened with it was that you didn't to become a citizen of a country, you didn't have to have the same religion. But it used to be that you could not be a citizen. Not that they really had an idea of a citizen back then, but to really be in the ruling or an equal member of society, whatever the society is, you had to be a specific religion of whatever the hegemony was. So of course, Jews were out of power for most of history, right? But in the 1700s, really starting in France and Napoleon, Jews were allowed into society and allowed to become free and equal citizens in France, basically, at the time. And even if they didn't convert, so they can keep their Judaism, but become free and equal citizens to everybody else in France. This sounds wonderful. Of course, everybody was excited about this, and this is just wonderful and huge step forward. But there was a problem, and there's a massive problem. Jewish law doesn't only govern ritual matters. It doesn't only govern how to, eat kosher and how to daven 3 times a day and Shabbos and all these things that we talk about in Judaism now. It was much bigger than that. There's so much legislation and halacha and law about Jewish civil matters. What happens if I steal something from you? How am I punished? How is that proven? What is the recompensation that I have to pay? Everything like this. What happens if I murder someone? What happens if I want to have a business contract with someone? How is that going? There's whole tractates of Talmud. They're really complicated, really big on every area of civil. The reason is because the way Jews lived in before Enlightenment is that they lived at the behest of whatever hegemony was there. They would let the entire Jewish community in, and they would live there. Jews would live there, protected by the monarch, basically at will, right? At the grace of the monarch. At any moment, they could turn around and say, "You know what? I don't like those Jews anymore. Let's kill them all and throw them out." There was no rights. Jews had no rights. They had no ability to own land. And they really weren't what we would call citizens, right, of that country. They had to live in a certain place. They couldn't live anywhere they wanted to. They had to live amongst themselves. And most importantly, for our context, they were governed by their authority. So there was a Jewish area, and those Jews were governed by rabbinical courts. And so for most of Jewish history, when Jews had a conflict or a problem or a legal affair, they would go to a rabbinical court. They would be judged according to Torah law, right? And that's the way it sort of worked for a long, long time. But obviously, if Jews were going to become equal and free citizens in France or in an enlightened country, they couldn't continue doing it. You couldn't have, because if I'm a Jew and I stole something, I'm going to be beholden by French law, just like if I'm an equal citizen. That's what it means to be an equal citizen. So all of a sudden, Jews have this problem of like, well, but my Torah says I have to judge it according to this. So what happens to those laws? And there was a big sacrifice that was made. That was basically the idea was that Jews would observe the civil law of whatever area they lived. They were accepted as free citizens. They would observe the civil laws as their halacha. So, I can't say, well, I'm a Jew, so I don't have to put my seatbelt in the car, or I can, steal something, because maybe that's not true by Jewish law. No, I am beholden by the law, whatever I am, because I'm a free and equal citizen. Okay, but that was the sacrifice that was made. Now, before, if you, as a Jew, did not want to observe Judaism, you had no choice. You had to observe Judaism. Why? Because we did not observe the law of Judaism. We didn't observe Shabbos, Kashrut, anything like that. You didn't come to minyan. You and your family would be kicked out of the community. And that doesn't mean, oh, you don't get to daven the way you want to. You can't be Jewish. No, you were thrown out. You no longer live in that area. And back then, if you didn't live in a certain town that had walls around it and protection, you had absolutely you couldn't live anywhere. And you weren't going to be invited anywhere else because you were Jewish. They're not going to let you unless you converted to Christianity or something like that. So you weren't let in anywhere else. And so that basically was a death sentence. If you were thrown out of your community, it was a death sentence. You would have been killed. You had no way to live on your own. So basically, it forced the Jewish people to keep their religion and keep by social pressure and survival, right? Now, all of a sudden, if the real authority is the French government doesn't care whether I observe Shabbos or Kashrut or anything like that. So all of a sudden, there was a choice to practice Judaism. It was not a choice before the 1700s. And so, of course, Jews responded in different ways, right? There were Jews who said, and by the way, so I think it did pre-Enlightenment Jewish communal structure. This thing, I did Haskalah. Haskalah is just the Hebrew name for enlightenment. Napoleon's Sanhedrin. I'm just looking at this now. That I'm just making sure I use the terms I wrote down. Napoleon's Sanhedrin was when Napoleon got together a group of rabbis and asked them, "Would you be willing to behave according to French law and put aside your Jewish law in order to follow French law?" Right, and they said yes in terms of the civil matters. Right, obviously, if the French government said you can no longer keep Kashrut or Shabbos, that would be different. But are you going to come to a French court when you steal something from somebody else or have a legal matter with another person? And the answer is yes. So that's Napoleon saying. So we talked about how Jews practice and Jewish communal structure pre-Enlightenment, right? And so all of a sudden Jews had this choice. They can choose how to practice Judaism. And you can imagine there were some Jews who were like, okay, now that I have the choice to practice Judaism, no one's forcing me to keep Shabbos and Kashrut. And look, the French are being so nice to me. They want me to be free and equal citizens. And of course, the same thing happened in Germany, and the same thing happened in England, a couple of years apart, and of course in America as well. Many Jews said, well, okay, I'm going to blend in. Now's my time. I could be a French person. I can have all the power in the world without converting to Christianity. I'm going to look completely Jewish. So I'm going to alter my practice of Judaism so that it fits completely in the society in which I'm living. So for this really is what Reform Judaism is. And Reform Judaism is really the first movement that came out. People kind of started doing it, and then it really became a movement of this idea that Jews are allowed to pick and choose what they choose to do. It's not that halacha, Jewish law is not an obligation, because now we are French citizens, or we are German citizens, or we are American citizens, or English citizens. So we're no longer forced to practice our Judaism, so now we get to choose what we want to do. And for the most part, that meant also choosing to do the Jewish practices that fit in Christian society, in the society in which they were living. And then also altering Jewish practices so they fit in society. So for example, if you were to follow the kosher laws of Judaism, it would be very hard to live in French society because there's no kosher restaurants, there's no kosher grocery stores, and how are you going to eat with other people? And it just doesn't make sense, right? So people stopped keeping kosher because they said that doesn't fit in French society. I can't be an equal French citizen by doing that. I can't rest on Shabbat because if I rest on Shabbat, if French stores are open on Saturday and I can't open my business on Saturday, I can't compete, right? So that therefore that means that that doesn't fit in French society. I'm going to get rid of that. But anything that, and including, if I have religious services on Saturday, that's not going to work because I got to work. So what do? They switch religious services to Sunday. So Reform synagogues for a long time had services on Sunday morning because that's when the Christians were doing it, again, to match up to the society in which they were living in, so they can continue practicing a form or a remnant of Judaism that sort of fit in the society in which they were living in, but allowed them to be full and equal assimilated people. And of course, you can imagine there are many Jews who were very upset about this, right? Why would they be upset about this? What do you think?
Because traditions and practices can get lost.
Exactly. Right? You shouldn't change your religion and practices and lose them based on whatever culture you're living in, right? Who cares that you're a French citizen? You should still practice your Judaism, right? It might be that we're not going to use the Jewish, we're not going to use Jewish civil courts. Doesn't mean you should give up on Shabbat or Kashrut or all these things, or just even if it doesn't make sense to Christians, that doesn't mean you should give it up. You bear the consequence. You're Jewish. We still have the covenant with Hashem. We got to do it. That was Orthodox Judaism, and it really came as a reaction to Reform Judaism in Germany, saying we could be full and equal German citizens, because at this time this was Germany that this happened, and we can observe all of the halacha and the law of Judaism, besides, of course, the civil law, which couldn't be observed, right? That we can still keep Shabbos fully, keep Kashrut fully, keep all these things fully, and that Judaism does not need to change over time, right? But rather we should keep the tradition, keep the halacha no matter what, and continue to do it. That's Orthodox Judaism. So when the most funny thing that people say when Orthodox Jews say, we're the real Jews, we're the traditional Jews. It's not true. Actually, Reform Judaism is older than Orthodox Judaism. And if they say, well, we just didn't change. Well, it's because before that there was no choice. There's no choice of whether you're going to be Jewish or not, or how you're going to practice. Right? It's not like all of a sudden people became rebellious against God. It's all of a sudden they had a choice, right, for the first time. Finally, there's conservative Judaism, which is, of course, our synagogue, which is a reaction to Reform Judaism. So really a break-off movement from Reform Judaism, and with the idea that Reform Judaism is going way too far, right? That we can still keep ritual matters like Kashrut and Shabbat, and but that doesn't mean that Judaism doesn't change over long periods of time. So really, the idea of conservative Judaism is the catchphrase of conservative Judaism is tradition and change. right? That we try to keep tradition, but understand that Judaism does change really slowly over time. But Orthodox Judaism says Judaism is completely stagnant and should never ever change, nothing, right? And Reform Judaism says everything changes in Judaism. Conservative Judaism sort of takes a middle, more moderate position. And then finally, was a reaction is Enlightenment Zionism, right? And a lot of times these aren't included in the movements, but they should be, because really Zionism came out of a similar period, which really was a reaction of basically seeing that for example, Theodor Herzl, right? This really is Theodor Herzl. And Theodor Herzl, who's the progenitor of modern Zionism, was living in France and wanted to be a full French citizen in the 1800s in France and believed France was the greatest in the world. And who cares about Judaism and who cares about being a Jew? Completely assimilated person, not religious. But he basically saw that unfortunately, no matter how much Jews changed their religion or changed the way they behaved, they were not being accepted, and there was still horrible, horrible anti-Semitism. So the idea of Zionism was the fact that Jews are going to, no matter what, no matter where they live, no matter what the government says, they're always going to be subject to anti-Semitism. And so the only solution to that is to move somewhere and form a Jewish polity. That only until the Jews are living in a land that's run by them and their sovereignty and their nation state, right? And this also, of course, came out at a time when people believed in nation states, right? That became a thing, and Germany became Germany, and England became England, and all these things. That was a response to Enlightenment, and so that really is where Zionism sort of came out of, at least political Zionism, the brand that is most known by Chaim Weizmann, Theodor Herzl, and all these things. So that really is a response to Enlightenment. So the modern denominations that we see today of Judaism are really a response to Enlightenment. They're a response to a historic problem, which is how to maintain a Jewish identity and Jewish practice, Jewish tradition, Jewish religion, while being a free and equal citizen in a foreign country, right? Which never happened before, right? Again, so many Jews look back at the previous period. Imagine Jews living in Yemen or living in Poland in the 1600s, like, oh, they were just Polish citizens who happened to be Jewish, like today. Not the case. They lived in their own land. They were governed by their own rabbinic councils. They were not Poles in any way, shape, or form, right? So this was radical, and this was a really, and of course, I didn't put it on here, but then there's also ultra-Orthodox Jews, Haredi Jews, who went even farther than Orthodox and said, not only do we have to keep our Jewish practice no matter what, we have to reject any changes from modern society. We're not going to dress like the Goyim. We're not going to do any, even if it has nothing to do with Judaism, we're not going to observe their holidays. We're not going to eat the foods that they eat. We're not going to speak the language they speak. So we'll live there, but we're not going to take on any other traditions, because any assimilation that we do is going to result in our loss of Jewish practice, right? And that's why when you meet ultra-Orthodox Jews, they're wearing clothes from Poland from the 1600s, right? And that's why they don't dress the way they do because Jewish law tells them to. It's because this is at least the way they imagine Jews dressed in the 1600s, so that they continue to wear that exact dress and they don't change anything based on the country they're living in. Does that make sense? That's why they speak Yiddish and not English.
Why the 1600s?
Before, but I mean that roughly, before Enlightenment.
Okay.
It's from whatever it was before Enlightenment, before Jews were affected by it. This is in their imagination. I don't think it's really true. Jews definitely look different if they lived in Yemen versus they lived in Eastern Europe. It's based on like sort of a false myth. But again, they don't believe in science, so like that's also Western, right? So there's also there's also that as well. So you can't really have an argument with them about this. So that's what they do. They're not the real Jews. They're just Jews who reject modernity altogether. They don't have the internet. They don't have, smartphones. They don't have. They don't send their kids to secular schools. They don't want their kids or their family interacting with non-Jews at all. They don't even want their family interacting with Jews who are Haredim or are ultra-Orthodox, because that puts them in danger of integrating into non-Jewish society. Make sense?
Mhm.
All right, I think we got through everything for today. Any questions on anything we went over?
Were there in the Sephardic community, were there similar like responses? Do I understand that these movements, the Reform, Orthodox, and Conservative, are from mostly the Ashkenazi tradition?
Ashkenazi, yes, really great question, a really great point, really great observation. Should have actually said that. Yes, these movements really only exist in the Ashkenazi. Why? Because the Arabic world didn't really go through enlightenment the same way in the 1700s as as Jews. Jews were never accepted as free and equal citizens in Arabic lands. They were kicked out in 1948, and Jews were kicked out of every Arabic land in 1948 with the establishment of the state of Israel, or killed. There were substantial Jewish populations until 1948. Every Arabic Muslim land, they were all kicked out, either moved to Israel or America. Which is really funny when you talk about ethnic cleansing. That's what ethnic cleansing looks like. Look at the numbers of Jews before 1948 and after 1948 in any Muslim country, and you'll see what it looks like, what it looks like to cleanse a society of a particular religion or ethnic group. Because of that, Sephardic Jews don't really have denominations in the same way. They rely much more heavily on ethnic denominations, right? So Syrian Jews have a little bit of a different practice from Persian Jews, right? Who have a different practice than Taimani Jews, which is the Hebrew word for Yemenite Jews, or Moroccan Jews, right? So really, Sephardic Jews really had differences of practices based on their region of which country they came from. While Ashkenazi Jews really classify themselves usually by denomination because they had to contend with enlightenment, which Sephardic Jews were never challenged by in that regard.
And then like today in Israel, where many of these people have moved to, is there like, how does that like communication work? If someone wants to visit like the neighbor synagogue, or are there like, I'm thinking like St. Patrick's Day, like here, many people who don't have Irish heritage still celebrate St. Patrick's Day. Is there like a similar practice like today in Israel with that?
You mean like, give me an example,
There's all these regional practices. Is it something where that like now the entire community like will celebrate? Oh, this is what they do in this community, and it's celebrated like as a nation, or is it still kind of?
There's some things. There's sometimes we take on a Sephardic practice or we take on a Hasidic practice from a different region, but for the most part, not really. Because 90% of Judaism we have in common. Between all these groups, 90, besides maybe Reform, because again, Reform really took out a lot of Judaism, and I'm not talking about conservative Jews who are like our congregants. Like conservative Judaism, the way it's supposed to be, should be very close to Orthodox Judaism, very close, at least practice-wise. Didn't really work out that way, but in history, and we'll talk about that in the third session. But for the most part, I mean, like there's so many traditions in halacha. None of this has to do with actual halacha and actual Talmudic law. We all have the same Talmud. We all have the same Bible. We have all that. It's just that the rabbis responded and interpreted that law differently throughout centuries and centuries of experience, based on, for example, let's take an example. So, famously, one of the famous differences between Jews, Ashkenazi Jews, and Sephardic Jews is happens to be on Passover. So Ashkenazi Jews on Passover can't eat what's called kitniut, which is rice, beans, legumes, that kind of thing. On Passover, there's a general halacha that you can't eat chametz, which means leavened bread, right? Bread that has had time to rise, which matzah, right? So Ashkenazi Jews have had the practice for centuries for not eating rice, beans, all this stuff, legumes. Even though it has nothing to do with, has no grain in it, has no chametz in it, nothing whatsoever, we have the practice of not eating that. Well, Sephardic Jews do eat those things on Passover. Leniency. Now, why? Well, the way that legumes and beans and rice were traded in Eastern Europe was they were put in the same barrels as grain was. So oftentimes before the modern FDA, when you bought beans, there was some chametz in it, there was some grain in it, because again, you have the same barrel, you fill it up, didn't have the same sanitary practices. That was the practice in Ashkenazic lands of the economy, of the way people did things. But in Sephardic lands, that didn't happen. That economic practice didn't exist. And there was no mixing of beans and grain in the same way. It has nothing to do with Judaism. It's just the way economics are practiced in those areas. It's the fact of the matter. And because of that, the rabbis in Ashkenazi in European lands ruled that Jews can't eat beans, legumes, and rice on Passover because it might have chametz in it, while rabbis in Sephardic areas never made that ruling because it was never a problem. So now we have this Ashkenazi Jews still keep this, even though today there's an FDA, there's no, if you know it's gluten free, it doesn't have any grain in it, right? Well, Sephardim eat kidney yolk now, right? But now the conservative movement has given us permission to take on that Sephardic practice because there's an FDA. We really know what's in food and what's not. But that's just to give you an example of how these differences happen. A lot of times it's just historic circumstance. And Jews, once the tradition starts, we keep it, right? Tradition, if you like, should watch Fiddler on the Roof at some point. Make sense? Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Anything else? You have fun today? Good. Wonderful. Well, ask me any questions anytime. Rabbi Marcus Rubenstein at templeofaaron.org or rmr@templeofaaron.org. I really appreciate, of course, being with everybody today and getting to learn with you. The skies are brightened outside after that storm. And until next time, I think we're meeting next Tuesday for our second session on Reformed Orthodox Judaism. Thank you, everybody.